Ukraine's middle strike campaign is burning Russian logistics on a daily basis, but it's not really affecting frontline operations, at least not yet. Today we're joined by Michael Kofman, who is just back from a research trip to Ukraine to talk through his observations on the ground. We get into the impact of the middle strike campaign, the leadership shuffle at the top of the Ukrainian military, the serious challenges Russia faces this year, and more. Michael's a senior fellow in the Russia and Eurasia program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, where he focuses on the Russian military, Ukrainian armed forces, and Eurasian security issues. You can follow his work at the links in the description below. And with that, let's get to the conversation. All right, Mr. Kofman, sir, thank you so much for taking the time. I'm sure you're busy. You're just back from a fresh trip to Ukraine, so looking forward to diving in and kind of unpacking what it is you learned while there.
Yeah, good to be back on your program.
So I don't know how long it's been since your last visit, but maybe we can start there. What was different this time around that you were able to observe from the last time you were on ground in Ukraine?
Sure. So last time I was there was in March. It's been a couple months, and that's about the kind of the op tempo I prefer for visits, where you go every about 3 months or so. There's enough change for you to actually detect some change in terms of tactics. Also, the conditions, the seasonality really matters. Fighting in Ukraine in the winter is very different from fighting in the summer, right? So terrain cover returns. Usually, Russian forces make their greatest advances in the summer because terrain cover enables infiltration tactics. It's also, it's also just a lot warmer, a lot nicer, and you see a higher intensity of offensive operations during this time period, higher rate of airstrikes, drone strikes, what have you. And then typically like around summer, mid to late summer, Russian offensive intensity tends to peak, right? Before we get into the fall. And then often I'll go back later around late October, early November. And these sort of 3 periods of the year from my point of view are just very useful to be able to both monitor what's going on, engage with troops, and get a sense of how technology or tactics are evolving without being there too much. Because you also don't want to just, hang out with folks that are trying to fight all the time and ask them questions and also endanger yourself and your own and local team. So briefly, what changed? So first, surprisingly, and perhaps maybe not on the Russian side, part of the reason they're not doing that well is not that much changed on the Russian side. If you look at the tactics they are employing this year, part of the reason they are not having much success is they didn't really change much from 2025. Okay. And the Ukrainian military already optimized to defend against the way that they are attacking by infiltration tactics. So that's the first comment, is that actually on the Russian side, not much change. They're still trying some interesting combinations of mechanized assaults. For example, they're trying now increasingly to use mechanized assault as a distraction for light motorized attack. And the main threat element's the light motorized attack, and they're just using armor to try to suck in all the drone teams, while at the same time conducting a larger light motorized attacks with guys on motorcycle, for example. And that's actually like the main threat. But Ukrainian units are pretty well prepared for it. With combination of preparatory fires with drones, with one-way attack munitions, and what have you. It's not necessarily working for them, but just you do see some units trying here and there more complex combinations of attacks. But in general, day to day, they're pursuing the same infiltration tactics they did last year and were very successful. Second one change, you see two parts of the front where Ukraine actually is not just contesting the initiative, but it has kind of its own crawling offensive. One Third Corps in around Liman, which I think in the coming weeks are going to reveal a bit more about their success. I don't want to get too much into that, but just to say that they have successfully held the initiative for a part of that front line. And the other one is by a grouping of Ukrainian air assault brigades over in Zaporizhia that have been slowly running their own crawling offensive essentially since the counterattack in February. We talked about it when I came back in March. And so they've had their own slow moving crawling offensive using tactics that are a bit similar to the Russian ones, but also but different. Fire teams clearing tree lines, not the way that the Russian military sort of sends one or two men led by a drone and then just sees whether they make it or if they get killed. And if they get killed, then they figure out, okay, we should send the next person down a different route. Instead, a well organized attack, but still using small dismounted infantry clearing tree lines, right? And then you have, of course, the innovation and the large scale employment of what Ukrainians call middle strike, the striking and operational depth, which has finally fixed the gap in strike capability they've had for a long time. The Ukrainian military had most of their strike capability stacking in the 0 to 20 kilometer range, maybe out to 30 in the last year. And then deep strike, 500 kilometers plus against fixed infrastructure and not much in between. Like, the Ukrainian military had a big dead zone in the 50 to 300 kilometer range up until last year. Most of the capabilities there were GMLRS for HIMARS, which can get you maybe 70, 85 km. Um, and then a few, attack storm shadows here and there, but not much in that you need in large numbers. So I think what happened this spring is Fedorov, along with other folks, had a clear vision that they would procure these capabilities and they would actually deploy them at scale at the same time to create a shock effect, right? To maximize the impact of this operational strike across the force, so that the Russian military would take a while to try to adapt to it, and it would have a real significant, at least operational effect on Russian forces, which it has. And I think a lot of folks who follow the war have seen the impact. You see both on Russian logistics and their ability to bring up troops and their ability to operate in the rear freely, which they had before, now being essentially shut off. And then secondarily, a campaign to isolate Crimea, which is also being done via middle strike capabilities by unmanned systems forces.
If we could maybe stick to the middle strike campaign for a second, because we see the footage and there's more stuff burning in more places every single day. And you understand that that has an impact. You can't just lose truck after truck after truck without something happening. But it's been a little foggier trying to understand what that means at the front. Were you able to glean anything like, is there a decrease in mechanized assaults, a decrease in reinforcements in certain areas?
Yeah, that's a great question. Actually, that was one of the research questions I was pursuing on this trip, to be very honest with you, because that is, again, something that you ask yourself. You see all the footage, you see folks tracking the number of Russian trucks and vehicles hit, but you're not, unless you're there near the front line talking to commanders in different parts of the front, it's very hard to understand, okay, what is the actual impact on combat operations from all there? And an honest answer is I think mixed. First, it is decreasing Russian ability to bring up troops, to bring up batteries and other things they need to resource the fight. Okay. And so it's having a suppressive effect on their offensive potential and offensive momentum. That's visible. And most people agree and see that. Okay. What is it not doing though? It is not leading the Russian military to halt offensive operations. In some areas, they have intensified drone use, like Konstantinovka, actually. They still have, not only do they have enough resources, but they have enough resources to increase the rate of drone deployment. Second, it's not leading to a Russian force collapse either. I spoke to both Ukrainian units that are primarily conducting a defense, maybe at best an active defense, but mostly on the receiving end of Russian attacks. I also spoke to Ukrainian units that are actually assaulting and are themselves conducting attacks on parts of the front where Ukraine has the initiative, to get a sense of how it's affecting operations in these different contexts. And the bottom line is, this having an impact. It's not having that decisive impact yet. I know for folks that might be a disappointing answer, but there's a couple reasons for it. First of all, this campaign, while effective, still needs more time, from my point of view, to work. And it has a long ways to go in terms of being scaled up. Ukrainian military is still acquiring more and more drone strike capabilities. More units are getting into this, for lack of a better word, the operational strike game. You see a lot of corps getting into it now. You see they're sort of supporting regiments within the corps, acquiring strike capabilities. I hope they will be able to sustain it, because a lot of this has to do actually with contracts and procurement. Units receive capabilities, they often don't ask where they come from, right? They sort of, they don't ask themselves like, okay, if I use all these capabilities at this rate, in the second half of the year, will I still get these capabilities at these rate? Oftentimes the shooter doesn't necessarily have this question of with the magical place that the missiles or the strike drones come from. Um, so I hope that they'll be able to sustain it from a defense procurement point of view. And lastly, it actually probably will have the least effect in the summer for two reasons. First, um, a lot of Russian targets are going to open up later in the fall as terrain cover disappears. And so middle strike will not just be hitting trucks going down roads, but they'll actually be hitting a lot of Russian targets throughout currently where they are in camp. They'll be much more visible. And I think a lot of people anticipate that this campaign will be more impactful in the fall rather than being rolled out mid-spring to summer. Okay, just because of the nature of terrain cover. Secondarily, the Russian military, by and large, is attacking day to day with through infiltration tactics and through very, very small numbers of dispersed men. This does not require a substantial amount of resources logistically to sustain. Okay. Most of the logistics are going to Russian drone units and to supporting fires, right? Like fuel is not going to sustain mechanized assaults, it's going to generators. They do need generators because generators are used to recharge everything. Where fuel is primarily going is to charge batteries on things. Pretty much everything you use has a battery in this war, and in modern life. So yes, it is having a suppressive effect, but I did not find it having the kind of decisive impact where you talk to commanders across different parts of the front line and say, Russian forces are not able to fly drones. They're not effectively defending themselves. They've halted offensive operations. That's not the case. And I think part of the reason for that is just both the way Russian military is fighting is not as intensive when it comes to consuming these resources. And secondarily, they're still finding ways to sustain the attack, but they're really constrained now at 40 to 50 kilometers. They can't just bring people up the way they could at the front. They can't just bring water or fuel up the way they could before. And you are seeing an impact. It's just not the kind of crushing impact I think some people expect when they when they turn on Twitter and they look at all the strikes and say, there's no way the Russian military can hold on. And the honest answer is it's not quite having that effect at the front line. And I didn't meet a single commander. I talked to many commanders from different units that told me, I think the Russian military has to stop offensive operations, or now it's going to be very easy to push them over in our offensive campaign.
So that middle strike campaign was kind of was presented as one of the major efforts of Defense Minister Fedorov, who just a few weeks ago, I think while you were there, was removed. There's been a bit of a shakeup there at the top of the military command. You have any thoughts on that?
I do. And I think on the one hand, I don't like overly personalizing things where sort of it's just dependent on Fedorov or it's just dependent on Syrskyi right there. Um, i- any war is the work of many hands, right? There's lots of folks involved in this, whether it's in the Ukrainian military or the Ministry of Defense. So often gets personalized where we have a couple people and we're focused on these personalities. I do. So I'll be very upfront. I was quite disappointed at the removal of Fedorov. He had attracted. It's not just about him. He had attracted a talented team. He had very good people working with him that moved over to the Ministry of Defense from Ministry of Digital Transformation. And he attracted some of the best people I know in Ukraine, like Pablo Yazarov, who was head of Lazar Group, a very well-known drone unit, to take over short-range air defense, for example, and try to organize that a lot better. And these folks were just starting to really get going. When you bring in a whole team, they were showing results. He came in with a clear vision. That was part of his problem as Minister of Defense. He had a theory of success that I've discussed before. I think even on your show that involves stabilizing things on the ground, which he and the military effectively did. I want to be clear. Like Ukraine's had a turnaround moment not even this past 6 months, but from late 2025 to this point. It's now in the best position it's been in the war since summer of 2023. And you can't credit Fedorov solely with this, but you also can't, take away credit where it was due because he did a lot as Minister of Digital Transformation. A lot of people think that he just came into his job as Minister of Defense. That's not the case. Many of the efforts that Steve responsible for include Sky Fortress, organization of a lot of, let's say, UGV, Brave One, Marketplace, all these things that people are familiar with are actually the products of his team in different roles and positions. So it's not just a matter of him coming over and being Minister of Defense as of earlier this year. So yeah, I was disappointed by it. Part of the reason was his very well known publicly and also unsurprising clash with Syrskyi and the general staff. Ukrainian general staff had their own clear vision of how they want to run the war. Syrskyi tended to personalize everything and wanted to run everything himself. And I mean literally personally. I don't mean that as a characterization. I mean Syrskyi went along the front and told units and their battalion commanders where to put their troops. Okay, on a
Wow.
regular
Okay.
basis. Um, to the point that I think at a certain point, there was just a joke in Ukrainian military that the Ukrainian military is large, but only has one battalion commander, and his name is Syrskyi. Okay, so And I won't get into it because a lot of people are familiar with criticisms of Sirski. I have my own. I think he had positive qualities and certainly negative ones. Except to say that that clash was expected. I don't think it was necessarily the only reason why Fedorov was removed. I think that Zelensky ultimately was in some ways kind of poisoned against someone who was on his team and a loyal ally. And a lot of it also had to do with procurement and the way Fedorov pursued the Ministry of Defense procurement budget, having an open tender, reducing procurement for certain types of capabilities, and not giving money to companies that just expected to receive significant funds from the budget, and also clashing with the general staff on their procurement priorities. Um, However, there's a positive that comes from this. And personally, I don't think Fedorov's coming back because he's only going to come back as a Minister of Defense. I don't think that's going to happen. I think Kamara is in. And now a big question is how much of Fedorov's team will stay under Kamara and in other positions. And hopefully, many of these people will stay on, even though Fedorov moves on to do other things, whether it's in public life or private life. That's the ideal scenario. I do think the positive change is that Zapata is going to come in. And with him in charge, I think you're going to have a different leadership and a very different management style, and also somebody with a very different set of ideas from Sirski. The only challenge is you are going to have a period of turnover that's going to, lead naturally to a freeze because when new commander in chief comes in, he's likely to replace a lot of the general staff. Okay. A lot of those folks were personally appointed by Sirski down to brigade commanders and the heads of different types of troops. People are going to freeze in place, as always happens, right? When you have like in the United States, when we have a change in administration, you have a transition team comes in. We have a period of time where everybody's looking left to right and saying, is the thing that I'm doing the right thing? Am I going to get fired for the thing I'm doing right now? Because I don't know if what I'm doing is represents the vision of the person coming in. So you are going to have this difficult transition period. I saw it from Zaluzhin to Sirski. There were months where people just couldn't do anything. They weren't sure if they're going to be fired or not, and they weren't sure if what they're doing is what the new commander in chief wants them to do. And on the one hand, I think this will work out for the best, but this isn't the ideal time to fire the Minister of Defense, right? To sack the Minister of Defense and to have this transition because Ukraine's actually doing well. And when you're
Mhm.
doing well and you actually have some momentum, that's not the time to come in and create a political crisis and to change the key people and their teams that are running things, right? Whether it's for better or worse. And I don't think that's a controversial opinion, Preston. Like when things are not going well and the leadership you currently have in place doesn't look like they're able to turn around, yeah, you replace the leadership. When they are going well and you suddenly replace the leadership and you can't explain to the public why you've done it, then no surprise there are people out protesting in the streets.
Yeah. It was interesting to see. There was a lot of pushback, it was interesting to see the pushback and then the decision held, from the outside looking in. I didn't know if that was gonna be enough to reverse the decision, and it wasn't.
It wasn't. It reversed, first of all, reversed the decision on the transition Zelensky planned because he planned to have the Minister of Interior come in to take over Ministry of Defense. And that lasted all of one day. Okay. So that's how Kamara came out. Kamara clearly was not his intended person to take over the ministry, take over the position. So Zelensky reversed himself on that. Second, he clearly did not intend to fire Sirski either. Fedorov essentially took Sirski with him in this whole thing. Um, and in some respects, I think Sirski was removed because the protest had two demands. Right? Demand number one, put Fedorov back in. Demand number two, remove Sirski. And removing Sirski was the easier thing to do. And so that's why I think Zelensky replaced him so that he wouldn't have to do the first. Uh,
Do you expect any change in terms of Ukrainian operational priorities or their strategy in and around the front with this? And again, understanding that it's gonna be a couple weeks, maybe a few months before it all shakes out.
yeah. So from my point of view, I think first what's going to change is not necessarily operational priorities because kind of the front is the front. And we're largely locked into the battles we have. Russian forces are focused on Donbass. That's where they're pursuing. That's where Ukraine is defending. The main problem areas on the front line are the seam between Liman and Slavyansk. That's the seam between 11th, 3rd Corps. Okay. Secondarily, everything in front of Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, where Russian forces are still steadily advancing, there's a high ground in front of these cities, right, and behind them. Once they control the high ground, they with drones can increasingly establish fire control over these cities. And I was just in Slavyansk and Kramatorsk for several days myself. And Kramatorsk is beginning to die as a city. What's happening to Kramatorsk is exactly what happened to Bakhmut. It happened to Pokrovsk. It happened to Dobropilia. And I wonder if I come back in a couple more months and there's going to be basically nobody there but, troops and command posts, right? That's essentially what you're going to get. And then Konstantinovka, most people are aware, was taking place in Konstantinovka, I think, with troops locally called Konstacha. Russian forces are steadily infiltrating there. I think, to me, it looks still a bit better than the way it looks from a distance, but by better, I still mean bad, in the sense that the situation in Konstantinovka isn't trending well. Although Ukraine has forces that I think are going to inflict a lot of casualties on the Russian military, I don't think Konstantinovka is going to be like Toretsk, where it's going to be a year-long fight contesting it. I do think that when it falls, it'll be closer to kind of the last couple of months of Pokrovsk and Mirnorod. Um, so, you kind of have the set battles, and you have Ukraine steadily advancing in Zaporizhia, and Russian forces also advancing on part of Zaporizhia. That's one area where both sides are actually prosecuting offensive operations at the same time, where I think you're going to see big changes. First, force generation. And this was, I hate to sound like a basketball coach, but a lot of the issues I had with Sirski's leadership and management had to do with the fundamentals. Like the fundamentals for my players just off. First, force generation. Sirski kept making new brigades. He even made 5 new brigades this year, and we're only 6 months into this year. The equipment isn't there for new brigades. The manpower isn't there for new brigades. To make new brigades, you have to go to an existing brigade, take their officers and staff, right, some percentage of it, move it over to a new brigade, and then direct newly mobilized personnel to this new brigade while starving existing brigades. And he did this constantly from 2024. It led to a huge scandal in early 2025 with the 155th Brigade, the first scandal with it. It's had 3 now. And then Zelensky forced him to suspend the creation of new brigades for a while, but then he went back to it. So first, like force generation, I think was a big issue. And also he directed a lot of manpower to assault regiments, the big ones, 425, Scala, and 225th. While the rest of the force was having, in some respects, trouble holding on because they just weren't getting the replacements they needed. Second, big issues in force management. I think that Japayevsky has a very different view of this. Instead of replenishing units, giving units pieces of other units, leading to an incohesive patchwork defense where a brigade commander has too much frontage relative to their force. But instead of getting replacements or getting enough men to form another battalion, they're basically given 2 territorial defense battalions, a police battalion, battalion tactical group from another brigade that's at half strength, but thankfully has like a National Guard company supporting it.
Oh,
And
wow.
I'm not giving you hypotheticals, Preston. I'm giving you
Jeez. Yeah.
real situations of how it's been for the last couple of years. Like these are real parts of the front, and not one part of the front looks like this, but there are plenty of parts of the front where the fight was difficult, where it looked like this. And now the commander has this grouping of troops. They don't know these people, haven't worked with them. They all have different levels of capabilities, right? They're not the same as having a, like organic set of battalions in your brigade. And also they just show up in your AOR and they don't know the terrain. And you have to build a defense from this instead of something that, from my point of view, makes a lot more sense or is more cohesive. Lastly, I think Tripodi very much believes in delegation and in the core system. And cores have started to congeal, and some of them have become really good. People are familiar with the good ones, whether it's, Hartias, whether it's third, whether it's first, but there's a couple of good cores out there already. And the rest are steadily starting to, kind of grow up as cohesive command organisms. They're building out their enablers. And you can see the impact. Ukrainian forces are fighting much better. For a long time, the Ukrainian military only had horizontal coordination between brigades and not really a good, useful operational layer of command above that. And you see in cores really making a positive impact, but that impact was heavily suppressed by a general staff that, one, Mike still tried to micromanage the force, still tried to tell brigade commanders what to do with their units, even though they had a corps commander above them, and still required their personal approval for a brigade commander to change positions, right? So essentially, you had 2 systems coexisting and constantly fighting with each other. And Ukrainian military in general has a kind of like bottom-up grassroots culture and does not interact well with more Soviet-style centralized directed management, right? Where the person who's the senior most much further away from the front is telling you what you're going to do and how you're going to do it. And so these systems constantly conflicted with each other. And I suspect that Japati is going to come in and help continue push that transition in the direction that I think it needs to go, right? In the direction the Ukrainian military has been trying to take itself for the last several years.
It is a major transition for any military around the world to go through a change like this, and I think we lose sight sometimes that they're doing it in the middle of a war. Yeah, it's pretty incredible.
Yeah, and folks also need to keep in mind that the original force that fought in in this war is in many ways gone. This is a military of civilians and people from civilian life, also being led in many cases by civilians. Sure, at the top you have experienced commanders, and you have plenty of people who have been fighting since 2014. But most of the folks are civilians at the end of the day. And you also need to adapt the management and leadership style to that force, to the force you have several years into the war, not necessarily the force you started with. Uh, and you also have a technologically sophisticated force. You have a force that's primarily fighting with drones, that's primarily employing UGVs for logistics or casualty evacuation. You have a force where infantry is still there, holding these picket positions forward, but most of the brigade are essentially supporting elements and fires units, right? And most of the casualties are now to people who are doing logistical roles or in drone units, further from the front line. Although there's still some that are still pretty close to it, a couple kilometers from it, but nonetheless, now you have most of the casualties are actually to anybody who's moving further in the rear rather than to infantry in the front, and that's been the case a year and a half for a year and a half now. So you have to adapt like management and leadership of the force to the way the fight's actually being run and to what's decisive on the battlefield. And the same thing goes with force management and force generation. You can't imagine that you have equipment and people to make new units when you don't, and you haven't for several years. And you can't just create brigades on paper, right? To the point, yeah. I mean, honestly, there are plenty of friends across the Ukrainian military were joking that the way the force was being managed by the end of the war, there would be no infantry, and everyone in Ukraine would be a battalion commander. You just keep creating. Yeah, if you just keep making new brigades, eventually everybody's going to get promoted, right? Right. You won't have any combat capability, but there will be a lot of officer positions.
That's right. A lot of retirement benefits, I'm sure, there. A lot of pension set up. That's good.
I know some people in the U.S. Army just heard that and said, "I don't see the problem." I heard what I heard is just a
Yeah.
feature.
Well, so we've been spending most of the time here on kind of the tactical and operational picture, incredible insights. If we could step back and look kind of big picture at the conflict, where's this headed? Because we are seeing things burning inside of Russia that have not burned before, at ranges that have not been hit before. We've got the middle strike campaign in some areas, some localized Ukrainian counterattacks, but Russia is still grinding forward. It's a slow rate of advance, but they are still moving.
Mhm.
Where do you see this going at this point over the next couple months or years? Are we any closer to the end of the conflict?
Yeah, I think so. I
Okay.
think for a while now, I thought that we were at the beginning of the end last year. I thought the turning point was really kind of last year. The the conversation caught up over the course of 2026, but it was evident last year that despite all these advantages in manpower and material, that the Russian military was overall unsuccessful in 2025. They couldn't make much progress along the operational directions that they prioritized. They couldn't achieve any operation significant breakthroughs, and they became increasingly combat inefficient over time. That their casualties they were taking relative to their recruitment rate and their rate of advance was too high to be sustainable. And we see the impact of that this year, right? Yes, Russian recruitment is still, to be clear, quite high. There's a sense that Russia's running out of people for this war. That's not quite true. What's really happening is that they basically have not been able to expand their force since summer, probably spring, summer 2025. And so recruitment is just barely keeping up with the unrecoverable loss rate. But within their losses, the KIA relative to those seriously wounded keeps creeping up. If last year it was a ratio of 1 to 1, it's this year around 60% of it. Around 60-40 split now. Yeah, believe it or not. So you're looking at a conventional war where on the battlefield, if you look at Russian unrecoverable losses within that mixture of those killed in action versus those seriously wounded and unlikely to return to combat duty, 60% are now killed in action. You may
That
have
is
started,
very
yeah.
high. Yeah.
It's not just high. It's what we analysts call statistically anomalous. It's it's not something one tends to see, and that is because first, most of the casualties are due to drone strikes, which are far less likely to survive than anything else. Traditionally, things that cause battlefield casualties are artillery, aviation, delivered bombs, what have you. Second, you are in effect in what folks call a kill zone, and there's almost no way to do casualty evacuation, especially when you're the attacking side. And third, the Russian military largely doesn't care about the people that they're sending in assault units to infiltrate, right? So they don't really have a plan to do anything for these people. Um, but it's a combination of those three things. But the bottom line is that, and I apologize for this kind of detour. You asked me about something else and where it's going,
Oh, it's good.
I'm a big jet lag, so I've taken us in a different direction. But the point I'm making is that uh, overall, it's not that Russia can't sustain this and it's just going to run out of people. Is that increasingly you see them not only not being able to expand the force, but having a deficit of assault capable infantry in across some of their units, their formations. And so just their offensive potential clearly kind of peaked last year. And yes, they're still making gains. They're still making crawling advances. They are grinding their way through parts of the front. But it's already clear to me that from the standpoint of what's happening at the tactical level, there's not much more they can do. And they haven't come up with much that's different from last year or that's going to work for them. All right. So yes, they may force an evacuation of Kramatorsk, but they're going to be fighting for the last 23% or whatever it is of Donbass for a long time. Okay. And increasingly, they're at risk of actually losing control of territory they've occupied. Right? Because Ukrainian forces figured out that by advancing this way, the Russian military creates a large gray zone. They don't control terrain they've recently taken, and Ukrainian military is increasingly figuring out, especially with more innovative units like Code 92 or First Separate Assault Regiment, how to do assaults backed by drones and actually try to return maneuver to the battlefield on a smaller scale. Um, the challenge I see for Ukraine is that the Russian military switched to the bombardment campaign. And one thing you do see is significant increase in use of glide bombs, particularly against cities that are near the front or near the Russian border, like Sumy. Increased use of not just drones, but drones using jet propulsion, Duran 4 and 5, which are much more difficult to intercept, and placing greater emphasis on them. But just increasing much larger rate of drone strikes. If in January you might have had 6,500 large one-way tag drones being employed per month, more recently you're looking at around 8,500, and it keeps creeping up.
Wow. Yeah.
Um, And then significant increase in use of ballistic missiles. And that's the main challenge for Ukraine going into the winter, because as many people saw in July when I was there, Ukraine was out of interceptors for ballistic missile defense. That's one thing that it's still fully dependent on the West for. And that rate of supply, as best I can tell, isn't going to increase. And so the real concern for most folks in Ukraine is now what's happening at the front, which is an issue, is how to ensure defense of critical infrastructure and protect the population and enable cities to be sustainable over the course of the winter, because that's coming and Ukraine's already out of interceptors and we're just in the summer. That's kind of the biggest issue and the biggest priority for Ukraine. So what I see is going, I mean, I'll be honest, I am skeptical there's going to be a ceasefire this fall. I think that Russian political leadership is still, and like, let's be blunt, I'm talking about Putin because it's a personal authoritarian regime. So sometimes I even feel silly when I say political leadership, because you're just ultimately talking about one person and a small coterie of people that he may listen to. But nonetheless, it's just at the end of the day, it is one person making most of those decisions. I think the challenge um, I see is that first, the Russian military consistently misrepresents what's happening in the battlefield. On their maps, they are generally 15 to 20 kilometers forward of where they actually are. Okay.
That's tough for planning purposes. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And the main positive effect for Ukraine is actually Russian forces plan fire support based on their imagination land maps as opposed to where they actually are. So often you see them conducting strikes further in the rear because they think their forces are further along on the operational axis of advance than they really are.
Close air support isn't very close.
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, they don't do close air support to begin with, unless you're talking about drones and things of that nature. But even if you're talking about glide bomb strikes or more like reconnaissance strike abilities, you'll see that, yes, at tactical level, they're supporting their forces and they can see where they're fighting, right? But if you're talking about planning of other types of fires, you see that it's hitting more in the rear because on like Russian maps, they've occupied terrain and control towns that they don't, put plain and simple. Right. So that's one of the reasons why I think Putin believes that they're still doing better than they are. And then the other one is, if you look at just what's happening with recruitment, yeah, they're doing poorly. They clearly peaked in terms of recruitment levels relative to their losses last year, but they're not doing so poorly that they've started to lose significant amounts of terrain. And I think until he sees that, he's not going to change his mind that some kind of success is inevitable, and over time, they're just going to take the Donbass. And lastly, I suspect he's waiting till the winter to see if he can break Ukrainian will, with a bombardment campaign against cities, which historically has a very bad track record. I want to be clear. Consistently has a bad track record, especially if you've been in a war for a long time and it's clear that, you're not able to achieve operationally relevant breakthroughs. Bombardment does not have a good track record unless the war has very limited aims. And for folks who don't believe this, I can show you our war against Iran in the last 5 months. And I'll tell you, it's not a question of execution and technology. History is pretty consistent on this. But also, political leaders consistently believe that they will achieve decisive effects with bombardment, even though history tells you that you won't. So both of these things are true. Like, one, as analysts, I think we know that you can't achieve victory just in bombardment. And as analysts, we also know that you'll never convince political leaders that you can.
It's different for me. Yeah, this time it'll be different.
Yeah. This time it's going to be different. And also, last part, as analysts, we often have arguments because there's always another set of analysts that come and say, but the technology now allows you to do things you could, Preston, it now allows you to do things that you couldn't do before. Something. And it's true, technology does change what you can do. I want to be clear on that. And so at a certain point, maybe we'll be able to do these things. I just haven't seen it happen yet. Yeah.
Mike, I know you're busy. You got places to be, but thank you so much, sir, for walking through all of this and all the work you do, kind of tracking and following the war.
Yeah, and listen, I appreciate you, and I appreciate this podcast and your coverage as well. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. We'll talk soon.
Take care. Cheers.
All right, so thank you so much to Michael for taking the time to walk through all of that today, and it was a lot, wasn't it? I mean, everything from the changes in the tactical situation on certain sectors of the battlefield, all the way up to the strategic implication of Russian recruitment issues in their military. It's a lot, and I feel like we probably just scratched the surface there. So be sure to follow Michael. The link's in the description below. I'm certain he'll be going on more shows, more podcasts, more interviews, and writing articles about what he saw. So that is where you'll be able to dig into more detail of everything we covered here. But that's all we got for now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.